We actually have very terrible story to talk about, which I'm sure everyone has already heard. And we also have a few stories sort of connected to this that we've written about. There was the school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, that left 3 children dead and 3 adults as well. And, just a horrendous situation. I've been on CNN and C-SPAN talking about it a lot this week. Very hard, very, very hard situation, very, very disturbing. The police response, I've just talked about this on Active Self-Protection's podcast. Anyone who likes this podcast should really go and check that podcast out because they'll probably really enjoy that as well. But we talked about the police response, the badge cams that came out, and I can't compliment that enough. I mean, those guys did exactly what you're supposed to do. I think that's going to be the example that everyone points to going forward in active shooter response classes. I've taken several of them over the years, and those guys were on point. They're well trained. They communicated and they had urgency, and they were able to, about 4 minutes after they entered that building, neutralize that shooter. And I think they saved a lot of lives. So thank God for those guys.
Absolutely.
But 2 of the stories we've written about that sort of connect to this, because the shooter did use, they had 3 guns on them. One was an AR-15 pistol. One was a sub 2000, a 9mm pistol caliber carbine, and one was a handgun, a 9mm handgun. And so there's been a lot of discussion, as there always is after an event like this, about AR-15s and so-called assault weapons. I think the sub 2000 would probably fall under most states' assault weapons bans. So we had 2 significant stories. One you wrote about, which is actually one of the first major polls specifically of AR-15 owners. Can you tell us a little bit about that poll?
Sure, yeah. So this was a project of the Washington Post, sort of a joint project with Ipsos, which is like a polling firm. And as you said, they conducted an AR-15 owner specific poll as sort of a subset of one of their gun polls that they run regularly. They actually ran this last fall, but they are just now releasing it because they did a big series of pieces on the AR-15.
Right.
But what was interesting about
of quality, in my opinion, this piece.
That's right. I say that's right. There were certainly some questionable information in some of the other pieces, but as you said, this poll was cool to see. Yeah, it was a reputable pollster that conducted it, and what they found, one of the big takeaways from this poll, is they were able to come up with an estimate based on their polling samples to see just how many people they think own an AR-15 or a similar rifle, and what they came down to was about 6%, or about 1 in 20 Americans, they say, own an AR-15. Which in raw numbers, that comes out to about 16 million people, which a rough estimate, but that's, 16 million is a pretty sizable proportion of the population.
Yeah. Well, that's people who currently self-report as being AR-15 owners. So
right.
They own one right now. And this does line up fairly well, as you wrote, with some of the other estimates we've seen. The National Shooting Sports Foundation has estimated there were 24.4 million AR-15s and AK-47s sold between now and 1990. So 16 million owners would be, more than one gun per owner, but that's not entirely unreasonable assumption. And then there was also the National Firearms Survey, I believe it's called, right, from the Georgetown professor, William English. He found his estimate was a bit higher, but he looked at anyone who's ever owned an AR-15 or similar firearm, right?
That's right. Yeah. So he surveyed just gun owners generally across the country, and he found about 30% of gun owners said that they either do or have owned an AR-15 or similar styled rifle. And that came out to about 24.6 million people. It's a little bit higher than the 16 million. But when you count that the question included folks that maybe at one point owned an AR-15, it's in the ballpark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So pretty big numbers as we would expect to see. In this, what were some of the breakdowns on why the people said they owned AR-15s?
Yeah, well, this was pretty interesting. The number one self-reported reason for why AR-15 owners purchased their AR-15 was self-defense. This sort of tracks with broader trends in gun culture overall, where self-defense is overwhelmingly the number one reason people purchase guns, period. So I guess it sort of makes sense that AR-15 owners would also quote that. About 1/3 of the AR-15 owners they surveyed listed that as their primary reason, but upwards of 66% said it was a major reason. So it's clearly on the front of mind for folks that own these rifles.
Yeah, and then I guess demographically there was some interesting stuff too. For instance, military service. There was an interesting bit about military service in there.
That's right. Yeah. So not only were AR-15 owners more likely to have a past of military service than Americans overall, but they were also more likely to have served in the military than just your typical gun owner. It still was a minority of AR-15 owners that said they had served. I believe it was something like a quarter. But still,
but I think only like 7%. Yeah, and only like 7% of the population has served in the military. So you have a quarter of AR-15 owners have done it. That means they're significantly more likely to, an AR-15 owner is significantly more likely to have military service than your average American, which is interesting. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because the AR-15 is the same pattern rifle as an M4 or M16. It's obviously it's the semi-automatic only version of that firearm. But if you're coming from using that gun in the military, you're going to be used to the controls and how to operate it safely and effectively. So it makes sense that would be a common gun that you see veterans, picking up for themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny, they actually polled that question specifically. They asked among those veterans, was your time in service a deciding factor in you purchasing an AR-15? And it's funny, it was actually a lower number than you would think. I think only something like 4% said that was their main reason. But as you said, that could still be a contributing factor to when deciding for one rifle versus another particular weapon for self-defense, for example.
It might not be their main reason, but I'm sure it was a contributing factor for a lot of them, I would imagine. When you're trained on a gun, and it's one that was reliable for you in your time in the service, then it would make sense. But it's similar to why a 1911 was so popular and remains so popular today, because that was the sidearm for the Army for 80 years, and even still sees service with some units today. But that remains incredibly popular. Because of that, or partially because of that, at the very least. Interesting stuff out of that poll. And then we also had, of course, another development out of Delaware this time, right? A federal judge ruled on that state's new so-called assault weapons ban.
Yeah, no, that's right. And it's funny because there's sort of a linking factor here where we have documented polling data to suggest that anywhere between 16 to 24 million, depending on which one of these sources we've covered. 16 to 24 million people own these rifles, which you could use that to make an argument that these things are in common use and in common use for self-defense when that's the number one reason cited, right? Sure. And then you get to this case where gun rights groups were challenging Delaware's state assault weapon ban and their ban on quote unquote high capacity magazines. And the judge in that case, he agreed. He said, AR-15s and similar rifles, and as well as these magazines, they are in common use for self-defense. But nevertheless, he declined to issue an injunction blocking both of those laws. Because that was
the big twist.
Right. It's sort of like, whoa, hard left turn there.
When I first read, I think Rob Romano on Twitter, he works for the Firearms Policy Coalition, but he tweets out a lot of these decisions as they come out. And he was the first one I saw tweet about it. And his thread confused me so much because, his first tweet is like, oh, he denied this injunction. But then his following tweets were like, oh, he found that AR-15s and so-called assault weapons are in common use. They're in common use for self-defense purposes. They're the standard. It's not dangerous or unusual. It's dangerous and unusual, which these wouldn't qualify for. And then at the end, it's like, oh, no, yeah, but he still said you can ban them. And so that was pretty surprising to see, right? Because, I mean, the court, this sort of base level ruling in Heller was that any firearm that's in common use for lawful purposes, like self-defense, would be presumptively protected by the Second Amendment, which is what he agreed with, right? But then there's a twist after that.
That's right. Yeah, no, I was going to say, he even specifically says, yes, these AR-15s and large capacity magazines are covered by the Second Amendment. However, one weird trick, there's been these guns and these magazines, they represent a quote unquote dramatic technological change, and they bring unprecedented concerns for public safety.
Right. And that comes from Bruen.
Right. And so therefore, he pointed to sort of analogous laws, depending on your point of view, on, late 19th century, sometimes 20th century bans on things like Bowie knives and, billy clubs, and concealed carry as well. Some of the stuff we've seen in other gun cases, basically pointed to those as analogs for why, despite everything that he laid out before about these firearms being in common use for self-defense, that they can actually be regulated, and therefore he did not block Delaware's law.
Yeah, it was a very interesting ruling. And one of the interesting things about it too is that it's not the first time we've seen this reasoning, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, it's very similar to that Oregon case, the federal version of the Oregon case for their ballot measure that instituted a permit to purchase requirement and a magazine ban as well. And the judge in that case made a very, very similar argument for why she was unwilling to block that law before it took effect. So it's clearly something's coming together here where this is going to be a new argument that at least some judges are willing to use.
Yeah, this seems like this will be the template for how judges who are inclined to do so try to uphold assault weapons bans and magazine restrictions around the country. So don't be surprised to see this line of thinking pop up again down the road, especially when you get to like the Ninth Circuit or the Fourth Circuit reviewing these sorts of laws. Because I think that's where the gun control movement has coalesced on the legal argument side here. And so that's what I predicted actually after the Oregon ruling was handed down, the denial of the TRO, the temporary restraining order. I looked at that reasoning. I thought, okay, this is a more solid attempt to come to terms with Bruen, and while also upholding these modern hardware bans. And yeah, here it is again. We've seen it pop up once more. It's not a coincidence, right? I mean, this is the arguments that they make in the case, right? It doesn't come from the judges, really. The judges hear the arguments and then they decide whose side they think was more persuasive. And so this is the line that you're seeing from states around the country trying to defend their restrictions. And I don't think it's going to last long, frankly. I don't think this is something the Supreme Court is going to be okay with. Now, it may require them to actually get involved in a case and take a case for that to really matter. But one of the big flaws in this reasoning, besides the fact that I think the court would just say, once you've got, it's very similar to how they talked about the two-step analysis, right? That lower courts used to use to uphold gun laws, and they called it, one step too many. Right. And that's kind of what this feels like too, right? After you determine that class of firearms is in common use for a lawful purpose, I think the court just wants you to stop there. Like you can't ban those things. It would be sort of the obvious conclusion, I think, from reading Heller and Bruen. But, the other issue is that by this logic he's using, he's arguing that, semi-automatic firearms and magazines that hold multiple rounds of ammunition weren't, not that they didn't exist at the founding, because they did. Repeating shot firearms and magazines existed at the founding, and he notes that, and so did the Oregon judge. But they weren't popular as the idea. They didn't become popular until really the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So therefore, the idea is that you can ban them essentially with that logic we just described there. And of course, the problem with that is it's a logic that allows you, there's really not much of a limiting factor there. You could ban semi-automatic handguns, all of them, under this reasoning, and really all magazines. Right. I mean, that's sort of the implication that you get at here, and I don't see that seems to obviously conflict with Heller, which was about banning handguns.
Right.
So anyway, we don't know how that's going to play out. That's just my analysis of where the issues, the weak points of this ruling. But frankly, it's going to take a while longer to get to that conclusion, because you're still going to have to go through the other higher courts. And it's not clear that, especially in circuits where they have these laws, that the higher courts would be inclined not to adopt this exact same kind of reasoning.